Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here to share with you 3 ultra powerful mixing tips for mixing heavy screaming vocals that I just don't hear people talking about enough. Now, without any further ado, I'm gonna play an audio sample back of some screaming vocals, and I'm gonna share all 3 of these tips in detail to show you how I use them in my workflow so you can easily apply them to your own mixes and your own music. Let's take a listen. Now, before we dive into the mixing tips, I want to let you know that you can download these exact files that I'm mixing for absolutely free. They are part of my Crisp and Clear Heavy Mix Formula. The Crisp and Clear Heavy Mix Formula is a simple, straightforward PDF guide with clickable links to private tutorials and multi-track downloads. And the files you're hearing is from the vocal section. Within the Crisp and Clear Heavy Mix Formula, I share with you my go-to EQ and starting points for all of the main instruments within the metal production. And you can have instant access to the free download right now by clicking the link below in this video's description. So tip number 1 that I want you to ingrain is to not be scared of using a boatload of compression on your vocals. The funny thing is people will send me their mixes to check out, and often I'll hear ultra squashed, ultra limited, ultra clipped mixes, meaning what's happening on the mix bus, but simultaneously with vocal tracks that are overly dynamic and amateurish sounding. And a lot of times it's because people are scared to compress their vocals. I guess there are people on the internet saying that you shouldn't be doing this, but you can be rest assured that most pro mix engineers in the hard rock and metal genres go crazy with compression on vocals because vocals are naturally overly dynamic. And remember, they have to cut through the wall of sound, the wall of guitars, pounding drums, bass, and all that stuff. So let's see what I have going on these vocals in this mix. Now, these vocals, I'm actually using 2 compressors and a limiter all at the same time. Now, the first compressor in the chain, I have a low ratio, but let's pay attention to how much gain reduction is taking place in just the first compressor alone. So the first compressor alone is compressing the vocal by 12 dB. Now, a lot of times when people are tracking in bigger studios, they'll often insert a hardware compressor, and this is not unusual to compress your vocals this much before it's being printed to your DAW. I don't use any outboard gear, I'm only using plugins, so my vocals are completely dry. And by the way, if you download this multi-track, you'll notice the vocals are completely dry. They were recorded through this exact microphone into my cheap PreSonus preamp and interface. So these vocals have no treatment on the way in at all. So up first in my chain before my EQ, as you saw, we have 12 dB of gain reduction. Then we have our EQ, which we're gonna jump into in a second. Then I have a second compressor. Again, I have a fairly low ratio here. Let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place in this second compressor. Let's check it out. So around 16 dB of additional gain reduction. So far we're at around 28 dB of gain reduction. More gain reduction on a vocal than most home studio owners would ever dare to use. But I'm not done there. I also have a limiter after the second compressor. Let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place in my brick wall limiter. Another 12 dB of gain reduction. So we're looking at close to 40 dB of gain reduction. And as you can hear, the vocal sounds decent. It's controlled, it's brutal, doesn't even sound overly compressed. And here's kind of like a bonus tip for you. Instead of trying to achieve all your compression within one plugin, stack a few compressors, even if they're stock compressors, it doesn't matter, and achieve this amount of gain reduction over the course of multiple plugins. You'll end up with a much more transparent result. So that's tip number 1. Don't be scared of compressing your vocals. A lot of people seem to be overly concerned about this. Again, I find it funny that people are concerned about this, but have no issue squashing their mix bus. It's something to keep in mind. And this leads me to vocal mixing tip number 2. If you're mixing screaming vocals, do not boost high end. Now, this doesn't go for all screaming vocals, but more specifically, screaming vocals that have a lot of this sound in them, especially if you're doing brutal death metal, black metal, pretty much any kind of scream that isn't more of a shout hardcore kind of thing. Let's look at the EQ that I have going on her vocals throughout this screaming section. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm actually using a high shelf filter, and I'm reducing all frequencies above 8K by around 12 dB. I'm gonna solo the vocal, and I'm gonna bypass the high shelf filter. Let's take a listen. Desperate! It's working! Desperate! It's working! Now, if you're listening closely, you probably notice a bunch of gargle that's happening in the upper frequencies. These frequencies are going to clash with the cymbals and the top end of the guitars. And also, these frequencies don't do much for screaming vocals in the first place. Now, if we're talking about clean vocals, it's a different story. It's sort of the opposite. Sometimes you'll often want to boost top end on clean vocals to have them cut through. But when someone is making this type of sound with their mouth, you're gonna get a lot of that that you don't really want in your mix. Now, you don't want to completely remove it with something like a low pass filter, but a high shelf filter is a great way to go because you're simply reducing those frequencies without removing those frequencies. Big difference. So that right there is tip number 2. Reduce your high frequencies with a high shelf filter so you don't have any clashing happening against the cymbals and the guitars. And this is something that I hear all of the time. People will send me their brutal death metal mixes or hardcore mixes or black metal mixes or gent mixes, and I hear all of this high frequency stuff on the vocal tracks that are just unnecessary. High frequency management is just as important as low frequency management. All right, and this leads me to heavy vocal mixing tip number 3, and that is to not go crazy with reverb on your scream vocals. Now, I'm not saying to never use reverb on your scream vocals. There are certain subgenres of metal, like black metal, where that's a thing and that's part of the aesthetic. But I could say that more often than not, I could spot an amateur mix when I hear a ton of reverb all over all of the vocal tracks. The common pushback that I get when I mention this to maybe my students and also people that watch me on YouTube is they'll say, well, my vocals then sound overly dry. Well, you've come to the right place. I'm gonna reveal to you my tip for achieving ambience around a vocal without actually using reverb. The secret is to use a basic slap delay on your vocals subtly in the mix. What this is gonna do is it's gonna add a nice natural ambience around your vocal without that cheesy, amateurish reverb thing that you hear on so many local band mixes and amateur mixes in general. Now pay close attention to the vocal again in context of the mix and see if you could spot any ambience around her vocal track. If you're paying close attention and really hyper-focusing on the mix, you could tell there's something going on around the vocal, but again, it doesn't sound like an obvious room tone or a reverb. And like I said before, it's because I'm using a basic slap echo. And you don't need a fancy plugin to achieve this. I'm using a stock plugin within my DAW. All you need is a basic delay plugin, a stereo delay plugin. And the settings I like to use are 180 millisecond delay on the left and a 220 millisecond delay on the right. If you hear it in solo, it sounds like this. But what's interesting is when I play it in context, I'm gonna mute it now and take a listen. When I muted the delay, all of a sudden the vocal got really small sounding and almost too dry. And when I unmute the delay, the vocal sounds bigger and like it's in an acoustic space, but you don't hear that obvious reverb thing happening, which is the whole idea. And a little bonus tip for you is to roll off the high frequencies on your slap echo. This will help set it into the mix even further and will help make it sound even more subliminal to the listener, to where the listener doesn't even notice. They just notice that the vocal sounds realistic within the context of the whole production. So let's quickly recap these 3 tips. Number 1, do not be scared of using a boatload of compression on your vocals, specifically using a lot of compression over the course of multiple compressor plugins. Number Number 2, make sure you manage the high frequencies on your screams and reduce them so they don't clash with your cymbals and your guitars. And finally, instead of reaching for reverb, in most cases, use a slap echo or a simple slap delay. If you utilize these 3 techniques and put them into practice, they will make a massive difference in your vocal productions, specifically your screaming vocal productions and mixes. And again, you could have direct access to these exact multi-tracks that I'm mixing in this tutorial. They come with my crisp and clear heavy mix formula, which is a simple PDF guide that lays out all of my basic starting points for EQ and compression for all of the main instruments within a production. You also get private tutorials and a multi-track download for each of the individual instruments that I cover, including these exact vocal tracks. The crisp and clear heavy mix formula is absolutely free right now, and you could have direct access by clicking the link below in this video's description. So I'm curious to know, what did you think of these 3 tips? Are these new for you? Are they kind of old hat and you've heard them a million times before? Let me know by leaving a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And don't forget to click that little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. Until next time, happy mixing.